Okay, so I think, I also have a few words to say about Gennaro. But on the other hand, I want to give the talk, so I'll be very brief about that. But I think, I'm one of the few people of my generation here who haven't been a student of Gennaro, formally speaking. But in fact, so I think I first met Gennaro in Girona. I don't know if you remember that, in your class on indefinite, I think. And at that time, and I realized afterward that Gennaro was extremely patient because I was talking all the time and I knew absolutely nothing. And he was very patient with me. And then much later, he was extremely generous with me when he was an invited professor in Paris. And there was virtually no semantics at the time in Paris. And yeah, and it was, actually a major encounter because it made me work on scalar implicatures, and I wanted to prove Gennaro wrong. And he was happy with that, I think. And then in the end, I ended up agreeing with Gennaro, so there is no way to win an argument, I guess. Okay, today I'm not really talking about scalar implicature. I mean, there may be relationships with that, but it's really, there are conceptual relationships, but it's sort of a different issue. It's basically a talk about modified numerals. But I start with, sort of a conceptual puzzle. I start with this puzzle and I will go back to it. But in fact, it's not like the core of the talk. And the puzzle is this, that if you look at expressions like exactly or approximately or precisely, they seem to do two kinds of things. One is they manipulate a granularity parameter, so they have to do with precision, right? So if I say the distance between Paris and Lyon is 400 kilometers, that allows, for a liberal interpretation where it's true if it's not exactly 400 kilometers, but then if I put exactly, I'm insisting that it's really precisely 400 kilometers, and if I say approximately, I'm just, on the contrary, insisting that I'm really quite liberal, right? So it has to do with precision. That's one thing, right? And then there is something else, right? Which is that exactly when it combines with numerals, eliminates the lower banded readings of numerals, right? So in France, you can vote only if you are 18 years old. That's true, and that forces an at least reading for 18 years old. And if you plug exactly here, it becomes false, right? I mean, it's saying that if you are 19 years old, you cannot vote. And these two things are conceptually independent, right? So the question is, why is it that something that manipulates, something like a granularity parameter or a standard of precision has this effect on numerals? And it may seem obvious, but it's not obvious. And the reason why it's not obvious, yeah, so by the way, approximately does the same thing. So it also eliminates upper banded reading. It's harder to see because at the same time, it makes statements less precise, right? So, but if you say, so I could say, Peter has 5 kids, John too has 5 kids, in fact he has 10, so that's the at least reading. Now I plug exactly as in 6b, and that becomes, contradictory. Peter has exactly 5 kids, John too has exactly 5 kids, in fact he has 10. But in fact it's the same with approximately, assuming that having approximately 5 kids means, somewhere between 4 and 6, that the granularity parameter is sort of 1, for instance, then 6c is also contradictory, right? Peter has approximately 5 kids, John too has approximately 5 kids, in fact he has 10, right? And so there is a general fact about these expressions, right? That they eliminate upper banded meaning. And so it's not obvious, and I'm just now talking about approximately, assume, I'm going to be very informal in this talk, for most of the talk, so that something like that approximately phi of n, where n is a numeral, is true if and only if for some m in the vicinity of the numeral, so between, n minus x and n plus x, phi of m is true. So that sort of, as a first start, is okay. It's sort of an okay characterization. Then you get, John has approximately 5 kids. It's true just in case for some m in 5 minus x, 5 plus x, John has m kids is true. And then if you use the at least reading for m, so if having m kids is interpreted as having at least m kids, then what you get is simply something equivalent to John has at least 5 minus x children, basically. And that's a perfectly good proposition, right? So it's not, so the question is, why don't we see it? And in a way, I could give my story right now. It's a simple story, but whatever I say now provides motivation for the story I want to tell, right? So So I will argue, there is only one lexical entry for exactly and for approximately, and that the connection between these two functions, namely granularity regulator and maximality, follows from general principles of language use or grammar. I'm not sure which. And in fact, I'll concentrate more generally on modified numerals, whose meaning is standardly assumed to have a maximality component. And I will argue that this is in fact wrong. They do not have a maximality component in their meaning. Rather, the maximality component comes exclusively from an optional operation, and in certain circumstances, this operation becomes obligatory. So it's a little bit like, what other talks that we have seen, right? Various constraints conspire to force certain things to occur, right? So that was the logic of Luca's talk, and that was the logic of the work we did on Hereford disjunction. So it's the same general logic. Okay, so more specifically, I will show that starting from minimal assumptions regarding the semantics of numerals, some surprising and apparently unanticipated readings are predicted, and I will argue that this is a good thing. So specifically, I will try to convince you that there is a reading for fewer than 3 people attending the talk that make it a near tautology, so true if 100 people attended the talk, and a reading of between 5 and 10 students attended the talk that makes it equivalent to at least 5 students attending the talk. Yeah. Okay, and so the outlines this. So I'll start, so I'll try to be quite quick on this, because this is sort of common knowledge for some of us at least, right? So let's assume a few basic things about numerals, right? So that, they start as predicative expressions, like we are 3 means, that the individual denoted by we has cardinality 3, is a plural individual that contains exactly 3 members. And that for things like 3 linguists attended the talk, you need something like existential closure. Something, so that goes back to work by Barbara Parti and others. And you end up with, there is an X, a plural individual X, of cardinality exactly 3, and X is made up of linguists, I forgot that here, and X attended the talk. Now, the crucial thing here is that this is true if 4 linguists attended the talk, and that's so because attended the talk is a distributive predicate. That is, if in fact 4 people attended the talk, you can find a group of exactly 3 people who attended the talk, right? So that's absolutely crucial, okay? And then there is another reading. I'm going to assume that's quite controversial, of course, right? I'm going to assume for this talk that there is another reading which is, 3 is the maximal number D, such that there is a group consisting of exactly D people who attended the talk. So that gives you, as a reading, there are 3 linguists and no more than 3 who attended the talk. So, of course, there is a debate whether, that's just exhaustive or not. I don't really care. You may assume that it's exhaustive. It doesn't change anything for me, for what I'm saying today. So I'm just assuming some kind of an ambiguity for numerals, for bare numerals, and numerical variables. We'll come to that. So, so what I have here is just like a more formal way of saying that. So here, in particular, this is important. So, so I'm assuming some kind of a type shifting rule, but again, that could be set up differently. Where starting from a numeral n, we get something which is a generalized quantifier of properties of numbers. So how should you read this? So 18b is, so you have lambda n students are here. So that's a property that a number has if at least that number of students are here, because I'm assuming here an at least reading for the numeral, due to existential closure. And I'm saying among these numbers, 3 is the maximal one. So, if 3 people came exactly, then it's true that 1 person came, then 2 people came, that 3 people came, but not 4. And so 3 is indeed the maximal number of people who came, okay? So I'm assuming all that. Now the point is, once you have this in place, or something like this in place, and that I think something like this is needed for, in order to get the very basic facts about the reading of numerals, then you make surprising predictions for things like between n and m, right? So here it is. So let us treat, and again, there are different ways of doing that, and it doesn't change anything fundamentally. So that's just one implementation. So let us treat between n and m as a generalized quantifiers of numbers, that is, as denoting a property of properties of numbers. So basically, between n and m, when it combines with, so actually that could be the pointer, but I don't know how to use this. How can I? Yeah. Oh, okay. So what it says, so, between is a logative expression, right? So if I said John lives between Lyon and Paris, it really means there is a place which is located between Lyon and Paris, and that's where John lives. So here, between n and m, when, the idea that, it takes a property of numbers, so phi of n, and it says there is a number in this range that satisfies this property. And that's sort of straightforward if you think of even of the locative meaning of between, right? So if you do, they are, not there are, right? They are, these people are between 3 and 5 students. Everything is fine, so you get here an open sentence, they are n students. And you say now there is a number between 3 and 5, and these people are that number of students, and that's fine, right? It says the cardinality of this group of people is between 3 and 5, right? But now, here's what happens when you combine, this semantics for between 3 and 5 and the rule of existential closure that gives rise to the at least meaning for numerals and with distributive predicates. So you start like this, right? Between 3 and 5, and then lambda n students are here. And, suppose we use, the rule of existential closure to interpret n students are here. So here you get, there is a plural individual which has the property of being n students, and this plural individual is here. So that means, there is a plural individual made up of students of cardinality n, and they are here. And that's true, in fact, that's the same, in fact, as at least n students are here, because being here is a distributive predicate, right? So if at least n students are here, there is a group of cardinality exactly n, such that this group is here. And so now we have here between 3 and 5, and so and this ends up meaning there is a number between 3 and 5 such that, a number n, such that at least m students are here. That's what you get. And that means the same as at least 3 students are here, right? Not a good result, it seems, right? And, you can do things differently, but unless you make, undesirable assumptions, you are going to get that, whatever you do, basically. Now, the point, of course, if you use, the other interpretation for this numerical variable here, everything is fine because this is good. So, this here with n max, that is what results from the other rule, the one that gives rise to the upper banded reading for numerals, gives you here the number of students who are here is n. And then this tells you, the number of students who are here is between 3 and 5, and that's the good reading, the one we perceive, right? Okay. So that's sort of a generalization of the problem I mentioned in the beginning with exactly and approximately, right? That there are readings that seems to disappear, but it's not clear why, right? So, in fact, in joint work with Paul Marty and Emmanuel Chemla, we actually provided evidence that this surprising reading exists in the sense, at least, that it influences some, actual behavior in certain psycholinguistic tasks, right? So what we did, I could give a full talk about this, but I'm just giving you the main result. So, we presented sentences like this one, between 3 and 5 dots are red, paired with pictures with dots, red dots, different number of red dots, and 3 kinds of conditions, and they were controlled and all that. I'm not talking about those. So in condition 1, you had, for instance, that's just one instantiation, of what we did, exactly two red dots. So obviously this is false, right? And we asked people to rate the sentence on a continuous line, and that's, close to 0 here, right? As expected. So in condition 2, you had 4 red dots. So you expect the sentence to be judged true. right? The crucial case is condition 3, where you had, for instance, 6 red dots, right? Where on the lower banded reading that is, that seems not to exist, but is predicted by, from quite natural assumptions, their sentence is true. And on the other reading where you use, this maximal interpretation for the numerical variables, it's false. And what we get here is something which is quite high, right? So they don't like it that much on average, but it's significantly higher than here. And importantly, we also had another group of people had other sentences that never saw those ones. And the sentence they had instead of between 3 and 5 dots are red was the number of red dots is comprised between 3 and 5. And there, we lost the effect, right? So we take this as providing evidence that, in fact, this reading exists in some sense, right? We don't know whether they are aware of it, but they behave as if it exists to a certain extent, right? Now, the idea is to explain why. So I'm going to assume that this reading, nevertheless, is at least this preferred, right? It's quite clear, right? And it's a natural thought to have to say, well, it's this preferred because, when between, if between 3 and 5 ends up being equivalent to 3 under the at least reading, then, there is a clear sense in which you use too many words, right? I mean, 5 is totally irrelevant. You could have just said 3, right? So something like that, right? We're going to say that, right? Now, importantly, the reason why we get this result is, so let me go back here. So to go from this line to this line, we are using the fact that here, that the predicate here is distributive. That's what allows this step, right? So it's interesting to look at what happens when you use a collective predicate or a cumulative predicate, that doesn't license such inferences. So take, between 5 and 10 chickens laid more than 100 eggs. I could be, a farmer and I'm counting eggs and I'm realizing, that these chickens are very prolific, very productive, and I could say that, And that, of course, does not exclude at all that 11 chickens laid more than 100 eggs, right? I mean, it nearly entails it, I think, in a lot of contexts. And so, here, the right semantic, right paraphrase is something like there is an n between 5 and 10. There is a group of chickens of cardinality n, and x laid 100 eggs, and you have to have the proper semantics for, to give rise to the proper cumulative interpretation. That seems fine, right? And crucially, you don't want there to be a maximality component here. Because with the maximality component, you would get, that the maximal number n, such that n chickens laid more than 100 eggs, is between 5 and 10. And that's not what you want in the scenario I was describing, right? So this provides an argument that the maximality component of between 5 and 10 is not part of its basic semantics, but it's forced in distributive contexts to avoid some kind, it's some kind of a ban on triviality, So if instead it's a little bit like Hereford in a way, right? So you would violate some principle of language use, or possibly even a principle of grammar, I don't know, and I don't care for this talk, if you used between 3 and 5 to mean 3. Now, the same thing can be said for things like fewer than n. So here, so between 3 and 5, these kind of metaphor numerals haven't been studied, a lot, but, of course, comparatives have been studied a lot, and, it's a very, not the only one, but a very standard claim, and coming from instance, from a paper by Irina Heim, is that, fewer than 5, for instance, means something like, it takes a predicate of degrees, and it says that the maximal degree that satisfies the predicate is smaller than 5. And Irena provides a specific argument for this. So it's in her paper about the scope of comparatives. So if we are required to write fewer than 5 pages, that has a reading where we say, you absolutely have to write a short paper. Okay, I'm not, so that's the narrow scope reading. But it has a wide scope reading, which is something like the minimal requirement is below 5 pages. The professor did not demand something terribly hard, right? So, we're required to write fewer than 5 pages. It's not too hard. Of course, if you want, you can write 10. That shouldn't be contradictory on this reading. And you get the B reading very easily from such a semantics just by scoping out fewer than 5. So fewer than 5 combined with the property of numbers here, namely, or that corresponds to the set of numbers such that we're required to write at least that number of papers. So the numerical variable here has to be interpreted as an at least numeral. Okay? But, in fact, we do have pure existential readings of fewer than n, that the cases where you don't want the maximality component to be in the semantics of fewer than n. And, again, cumulative sentences, fewer than 10 chickens laid more than 100 eggs. Again, I could use that to say, to wonder at how prolific these chickens are. And that would mean, that can be true, of course, if 11 chickens laid more than 100 eggs. It often, contextually entails it even. So that doesn't mean, the maximal number such that that number of chicken laid more than 100 eggs is below 10, right? Because it's compatible with the situation where you can find actually 11 chickens with this property, right? It just says there is a group consisting, with cardinality fewer than 10, such that this group, these chicken between them laid more than 100 eggs, right? And interestingly, so if you don't have the maximality component, that makes fewer than 10 an upward until indefinite, not a downward until indefinite. And I think, it turns out that there is a contrast, an expected contrast in NPI licensing here. So fewer than 50 soldiers visited any castle is fine. So in my view, that's because visited any castle is a distributive predicate and will force maximization. And here, fewer than 50 soldiers surrendered any castle. That's a weird sentence. And in my view, that's because surrendered any castle is collective predicate. I think I went too quickly here. Yeah. Okay, so now the story now will be this. So I get, let's get rid of the maximality component in fewer than 5. So now fewer than 5 just says, so it takes a property of numbers, of degrees, of numbers, let's say, and it says there is a number smaller than 5, such that that property is true of this number. So there are complications because you want fewer than 5 people came to be true when you have the maximality component, when nobody came, and I won't go into this. But now, with this, we get something too weak for fewer than 5 people came. So you get there is a number n smaller than 5. There is a group of people x. They are, their cardinality is n, and they came, right? That, in fact, is true even if 100 people came, right? Again, because came is distributive, right? So if there are 100 people who came, then you can find a subgroup consisting of fewer than 5 people who came. Basically, this is equivalent to at least one person came. So it's a near triviality. And with some non-standard assumptions, and it makes the system more complicated. I don't want to go into this, but you can even get the tautology here. Now let's apply exactly the same lexical entry for fewer than 50 soldiers surrounded the castle. There, no problem at all, right? We get there is an n smaller than 50, and there is a group of soldiers. Their cardinality is n, and that group surrounded the castle, right? That's not trivial at all, right? So, for instance, it's not the case that if 100 soldiers surrounded the castle, this is true. From the fact that there is a group of 100 soldiers who surrounded the castle, it doesn't follow that you can find a subgroup of fewer than 50 soldiers who surrendered the castle, right? Because, you know, the whole group may have surrendered the castle, but maybe not in a subgroup. So that's not trivial. And so the logic of what I'm saying is here, well, you are forced to use the reading of numerals here, which gives you the upper bounded meaning. You are forced to do that because otherwise you get a trivial proposition here. But here you're not forced to do that. That's the logic. Okay. Yeah, that's what I've just said. Now the thing is, you know, going back to exactly and approximately, I mean, it's just a special case of the same thing, but it's slightly more complicated. Like the assumptions you need are slightly more complicated, but I hope you can motivate them empirically, if not, you know, conceptually. So the idea is still the same. So in the same way as fewer than n, and to a lesser extent between n and m. So I'm saying to a lesser extent because of the results we got with Paul Marty and Emmanuel Chemla. Forced the use of maximization, so which was my type shifting rule that gives you, you know, the upper bounded reading in distributive contexts. Exactly and approximately also forced the use of maximization in distributive contexts, because if existential closure is used instead, they become, in a sense, to be determined vacuous. I'm not going to really say vacuous. I should change this slide. So, you know, you shouldn't take this very seriously. You know, it's like minimal. You know, there are a lot of sophisticated works about how granularity parameters are manipulated. You know, I try to do things here in the easiest possible way. So I'm assuming that, you know, that numbers, say, are evaluated relative to a granularity parameter, epsilon. And what this introduces is something like between, you know, they end up meaning between n minus epsilon and n plus epsilon, and that's what's captured here, okay? And what approximately does is that it increases the granularity parameters. So basically, you know, if you have a, you know, an ordered set of granularity parameters here, you know, from 0, which means you are super precise, to, you know, more tolerant parameters, you know, approximately phi interpreted relative to epsilon j something here means the same as phi interpreted relative to, oh, sorry, it should be I plus 1 here. Yeah, so it's the reverse. So it means, you know, you go to a more liberal parameter, and exactly you do the reverse, okay? Now, approximately 4 people are here relative to granularity parameter 1 is going to be the same as 4 people are here relative to granularity parameter 2. That's the rule for approximately. And that means, in fact, between 2 and 6 people are here, right? The point is that if we use existential closure, we end up with an at least reading here. So that we have an at least reading, namely, you know, we get for some n in the range 2, 6, at least n people are here. And that means the same as at least 2 people are here, and namely 2 people are here. So approximately 4 people are here ends up equivalent to 2 people are here. Okay? By similar reasoning, exactly 4 people are here ends up equivalent to 5 people are here, when you use the at least reading. Only when you use the at least reading for numerals. That is when you use the existential closure operation. So here, so we want to exclude that, right? Because the point is that you don't get these readings, right? So it's exactly 4 people are here cannot mean the same as at least 4 people are here. It forces the reading of numerals where they are upper-bounded. So here, you know, I'm just going to stipulate, you know, don't use phi. You know, don't use a sentence with, say, approximately n. If you could truthfully use phi of m instead for some m. I mean, that's not very sophisticated, but I'm going to claim this. So here, so that's the case here, right? So on the at least reading, exactly 4 people are here ends up equivalent to 5 people are here, and the idea is we don't like that. Okay. So what I can say that I think there is there is motivation for this, independent motivation. So now I'm going to look at cases where the numeral is interpreted under its upper banded reading. And in fact, it turns out that this principle makes predictions also for such cases. So consider, the sentence, all of my students are approximately 20 years old. And consider a scenario where I know, it's important that I know that some students of mine are 19, that others are 20, and all the others are 21. Then 40 is perfectly fine, right? I could say that, okay? But look at 40b now. In the scenario, in the B scenario, what I know is that all of my students are 19. And I'm claiming, so I'm well aware that certainly, you could find context where this would be fine, but, at least that I'm claiming that there is a contrast between these two scenarios, that you need more, contextual conditions in the B case than in the A case. That in the B case, it's sort of surprising for someone who is in such, who has such an information, that every student of his is exactly 19, to say all of my students are approximately 20 years old. I don't know if you agree, that's my intuition. That should be tested. And the point is that this, this is an instantiation of this principle here. So if we have independent motivation, then we also have an explanation for going back to these cases, for why, when you use approximately for people, then you have to use the reading of 4 that gives you the upper banded reading. And likewise for exactly. How much time do I have? A few minutes still? Or sorry? Okay. Okay. So, well, 15 minutes might be quite a lot for questions. I have no idea. Given, no? Okay. No, I mean, based, okay. Okay. Let me take 5 minutes, Okay. So again, maximization, that is, this type shifting rule that gives you the upper banded meaning for numerals, is not predicted to be obligatory in collective and cumulative contexts with exactly, and that's what we observe, right? So exactly 20 chickens laid more than 100 eggs does not exclude, of course, that 21 chickens laid more than 100 eggs, right? Still in the context where I'm, telling you how prolific my chickens are. And exactly 50 soldiers surrounded the castle, according to me, doesn't exclude a situation where you have 2 groups of soldiers surrounding the castle, one group made up of 50 soldiers and another group maybe made up of 51 just, behind them. Now here it's complicated because there may be on top of that an exhaustivity effect that this is the only group, right? But you can put 43 in a down one entailing context to get rid of that. And so if I say, whenever exactly 50 soldiers surrounded this castle, blah, 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 I'm quantifying also over cases where there were possibly several groups of soldiers surrounding the castle, one of which contained 50 soldiers and another one containing 100 soldiers. Now here I have further predictions, but they're sort of complicated. But maybe I want to do this one. So on this view, okay, but I take really 3 minutes. So on this view, the maximality component and the and the modified numeral are they are separate components even syntactically. They can occur in principle in different positions, not always next to each other. In all the cases we had, they occurred next to each other. But that might predict an ambiguity. So here is one case. In every US state, one must be between 18 and 21 years old to be allowed to have alcohol. That's true. And it means, in every US state, the minimal required age is between 18 and 21. So it means something like the maximal age such that you must be at least that age is between 8 and 21. So that's basically Heim's analysis, right? But in principle, you could also imagine to have, the maximality component to be embedded below the model and having the between 3 and 5 scoping over the model, and that predicts a certain reading. I'm not sure whether it exists. Every patient, so now let's look at something that's, similar. Every patient has to take between 3 and 5 pills. So that, you expect some, under the part that's given in 46A, that should mean something like for every patient, there is an n between 3 and 5 such that, this patient must take exactly n pills. So what you're not saying, that there is a range for every patient and that they have a choice. You are saying they each have a specific number, but this number depends on the patient. And so it's hard to know whether this reading really exists, but if it exists, it provides motivation for separating the maximality component and from the modified numeral proper. And now I go directly to the conclusions. So I'm going to finish with this. So here I posited a maximization operation targeting numerals on numerical variables. I had a type shifting rule. That's really for ease of presentation. I could have done things in terms of an explicit operator. I could have done things, in fact, in terms of an exhaustivity operator, right? For all the cases I looked at. So maybe this is just another argument for the existence of embeddable exhaustivity operators. The maximality component of exactly, approximately, fewer than, etc., would then come from general principle of economy. That was the logic of what I said. Now, I should say, for reasons that I cannot go to now, that I actually strongly suspect, based on other data, that in the case of modified numerals, we really need a maximality-based operator rather than an informativity-based operator. Furthermore, if it turns out that if we used an informativity-based operator, some of the arguments I gave would actually lose part of their force. So something also that I want to go to. So it's a more complicated argument, first excluding the analysis in terms of informativity, saying you really need maximality, and then giving the talk I gave. That's really what would be the complete talk. Thank you.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, Benjamin. And I need to sort of digest the various lines that the various avenues that you're exploring. I want to draw your attention on a singular phenomenon that I ran into, which I think is very much related to what you're trying to do. And I wasn't aware of that. So there is one strange restriction. So there is this contrast between, universal and existential free choice items, right? So Irgendine, qua free choice item, clearly existential, right? So Irgendine student called, it means some student or other called. No, it doesn't mean every. Subtrigged any, clearly universal. John talked to any student that was around. If he didn't talk to one student that was around, the sentence is false.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. Now, any can combine with numerals, right? Any qua-free choice item is universal, but the minute it combines with numerals, it becomes sort of existential, right? So you can say things like, you may read any two books from the reading list. You can't really say, John read any two books he could put his hand on.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So this suggests that even though you can't tell in English, because in English you unlike what happens with this real modified, like Italian, due qualsiasi, you can't really use it in an episodic sentence.
Right.
You cannot subtract it. But I strongly suspect that the reason is the same. So if you have a universal modified by a numeral, so if you say something like, John read any two books, that is redundant. The minute,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So maybe you could find a collective property that would eliminate the redundancy, but what's complicated, you need some kind of a collective noun.
Right.
Collective in the sense in which VP can be collective. It's hard to find, actually.
It's very hard to find,
So,
yes.
so
Because
but
it
that's
has
what
to
you would
be
need,
fun.
and then you would expect this to be okay again, right?
Yeah. But so I resorted to a constraint to explain this fact, right? That you cannot have universal numerical free choice items. I resorted to something like an economic constraint that says that it would be redundant in that case.
Right.
So it's worth trying to think of the same.
Does it improve with any two socks? In a context where you are in fact thinking about pairs of socks?
Probably it does, maybe. So we should try. John, we should try to find a context where, but probably there would be some kind of embedded model or something, I suspect, in that case.
Following up on that, I think you can't say I collected any two socks, just like that, right? Or you cannot. And so I thought that even with an existential, the only time nothing works with the numeral, existential numeral, unless you add a modal of purpose, right?
Uh-huh.
So I don't know that this has just to do with the numeral per se making things redundant, higher numerals making it redundant. I mean, okay, I don't want to, I don't think it has to do with that. I think it has to do with the role of the covert purpose modal. So yeah, but you really don't get, you control for everything, you don't get it. You would get it. I picked up any two books and got out of there quickly. So, that's what makes it. Yeah, that's my point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, today we are not fighting on these things. Today, if you say it's numerals, it's numerals.
Okay.
I was just wondering if I understand in your treatment, the between N and M case are that kind of complex
Right.
quantifier is really similarly to, or modifier to similarly to approximately and exactly. You can also, I think, in certain cases combine, like you can use approximately or exactly actually to modify between M and N. I was thinking in a case, imagine a very strange junior position. Well, I mean, not so strange, it's a junior position. You can only apply if you have an age between 25 and 30. And exactly that. So, you can apply to that position if your age is exactly between 25 and 30 years old. So I was just curious if in that case, because it seems that what you're doing in that case, you're exactly or approximately, depending on the case you come up with, seems to act on the two extreme of the range.
Yeah, but it acts on it different, by means of a different mechanism. So what it does, I don't take that very seriously, but there are stories like that which are more elaborate. It really manipulates a parameter of evaluation, like an assignment function or something. It's not an assignment function, but it has the same status. While really between N and M, it's something completely standard, right? It's just it's a generalized quantifier. And in principle, you can combine them. There is no problem, right? So if you say exactly between 3 and 5, that will mean that you are precise about the range. I mean, that's not unexpected. But there are. I mean, in principle, I may make predictions, which I'm not sure are correct. So one thing I predict should be out is exactly more than 3. He read exactly more than 3 books, because more than 3 forces lower banded reading. And so, exactly more than 3 is always going to be exactly the same as more than 5, I think, according to me, because it just moves you upward, basically. But I do predict that when a modal intervenes, and so in these cases, more than 3 plus a modal, you can exhaustify the result, right? So John read more than 3 books. It cannot mean he didn't read more than 4. But John is required to read more than 3 books, can trigger the implicature. He's not required to read more than 4. And in fact, my maximal operator could do that as well, and could be constrained in the same way. And so now you could combine exactly with this. So it would be something like here we are exactly required to read more than 5 books, meaning that the minimum requirement is exactly 6. We are exactly required to read more than 5 books. I sort of predict that to be better than we read exactly more than 5 books at least, right? I mean, the at least was not part of the sentence. I predict it to be better, comma, at least. So I suspect that the contrast is real, but that nevertheless the sentence that I predict to be good is not so good. So that's actually, I think that some actually experimental work should be done about that to be sure with the data. So. Okay, thank you.
Well,